Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this winter evening here in Spokane, or those of you who are afraid of the snow and still local online, unless you're somewhere else in the country. It's really nice to have you here for our second lecture this semester. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy and environmental studies here at Gonzaga, and I have the pleasure of directing the Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. We host these events every semester on wide-ranging topics. Tonight's event is going to be no exception. As you can see, we have a number of other events coming up. Next Wednesday, we have a political science professor here from Gonzaga, Dr. B. Zhao, who will be talking about our trip to COP29 in Azerbaijan. And then on the 24th, here in the same room again, we'll be having a guest speaker from San Francisco State University, Gopal Dayani, who'll be talking about transition is inevitable, but justice is not, a really excellent topic related closely to our Jesuit mission. A new event that was just recently added to our lineup, we're co-sponsoring with a number of other partners, including the History Department and the College of Arts and Sciences, a screening of the movie Fish War. Notice that that's just in person. That will be actually in the Globe Room, not here, but in the Globe Room on the other side of campus on Sunday, March 2nd. Free and open to the public. It's supposed to be an excellent movie, and so I highly recommend that. And then on remote only, our only event that's remote only this semester, March 26th, on small modular nuclear reactors with a member of the Union for Concerned Scientists, Dr. Ed Lyman. And then two events in April to round us out, one on fossil fuel divestment. We've had an active fossil fuel club here on campus, Fossil Free Gonzaga. This is its 10th year, I'm sad to say. The students have been trying to persuade the university to divest from fossil fuels from our endowment for 10 years and are continuing to fight the good fight. And then on April 22nd, Earth Day, we'll round out the end of the academic year with a talk by me. This is a flyer from our friends in the History Department. If you're interested in Fish War, it has not been released publicly, the movie, and so this is one of the only ways of watching it if you didn't catch it at the Magic Lantern Theater. So I highly recommend making some time on Sunday, March 2nd at 4 for that free screening. As you know, things are complicated right now. With the new administration and its change of priorities, there's a lack of interest in advocating for climate action and a real change in attitude regarding whether or not environmental justice is something that we are still concerned about. In fact, there's increasing evidence that federal funds for climate work, including grants that the Climate Institute has received, are potentially going to be withheld by the federal government, which is troubling. These are grants that have been contracted with the federal government, fully executed, appropriated by Congress, and so really partly what's at stake is the constitutional separation of powers, recognition of legal contracts, but also the crisis itself, the climate crisis, which is continuing to be dire and growing. Some of the work that we're hoping to do with the federal support that we have is things like helping low-income residents in Spokane to get new HVAC systems so they can breathe clean air and escape extreme heat, have lower energy bills, to help create a network of community resilience hubs so that community members will have somewhere safe to go in moments of crisis, a place that could function off grid because they would have solar and battery backup, would have good clean air, so that when we have intense wildfire smoke or another heat dome like we had in 2021, there'll be a safe place to go. So the work is really important and significant. And so if you're interested and able to help us to continue to advocate for climate action here in the Inland Northwest, we would love your help and support if you're able to provide it. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Juliet Sinisterra is the CEO of the Spokane University District, which is a public development authority. Juliet holds a number of different degrees, including a Bachelor of Architecture degree and a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies from Washington State University. She holds a certificate in urban design from Syracuse University, Florence, Italy. She brings over 30 years experience in urban design. She's a really innovative thinker in our community, and the more I learn about the work that she's doing in the University District, the more excited I get, especially her work around biomimicry, which I'm hoping we're going to hear a little bit about tonight. How can we build urban spaces in a way that are mutually beneficial to the non-human parts of our world and are healthy for the human members of our world? I have a suspicion is part of what we might hear about tonight. So would you please join me in welcoming Juliet Sinisterra?
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for that, and thank you for having me here tonight to share what we are doing in the University District. Before I get started, I wanted to share just a little bit more about me personally. I am one of those born and raised in Spokane people. Spokane is very near and dear to my heart, having lived here most of my life and raised 2 children here, and worked in a variety of capacities, hopefully towards the betterment of community and health and well-being in Spokane. Both my parents attended Gonzaga University. My mom was raised in Coeur d'Alene in Spokane, and she graduated from here. My father is from Cali, Colombia, and he attended Gonzaga as a Fulbright scholar in the 60s. There we go. I come from a large and extended family in Colombia, and the last time I was there, I just wanted all Gonzaga students to know, I heard repeatedly from my family down there how much my father loved Spokane, he loved Gonzaga, and anyway, there's a lot of Gonzaga fans down in Cali, Colombia. With that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. I often think, too, with the University District that I'm well positioned for this role. I work closely with all 5 universities, not just Gonzaga, and my husband went to Eastern Washington, my sister went to Whitworth, I attended the University of Washington for a while, and I graduated from WSU. So I figure I got everybody covered in this position. But with that said, tonight I'm going to start with an overview of the University District, kind of what we're about, our history, and then I'm going to give some background as to what is often described as the poly crisis or the meta crisis. Having studied sustainability and energy issues over the past 2 decades, I have quite a bit of data to share. I don't want to overwhelm you, so I won't be doing deep dives in all that you'll see on the screens, but I'm happy to make the presentation available if needed. And from there, I'll get into how we as a district right now are working to bring a wider lens to urban development in light of kind of these multiple crises that we're facing. And a lot of this, you know, as students of sustainability and climate may not be new to you, but I'm really trying to focus more on kind of the role that nature-based infrastructure and can start to address some of the climate issues we face. So with that, just a little bit about the UD. So the UD, we're actually an umbrella organization for 2 entities. One is the Public Development Authority. That is a state entity that was created through an interlocal agreement between the city and the county. I have 7 board members on that, primarily elected officials. We receive tax increment financing within our district boundaries, which I'll show you here in a minute. And those get reinvested into the district. So we can invest in infrastructure, we can invest in parks and open space, we can do public-private developments. And then my other board is a larger 501c3 nonprofit board, and that's the University District Development Association. And that board consists of all the PDA members, but then also representatives from all 5 universities, the community colleges, the hospitals, Greater Spokane Incorporated, Avista Utilities, and a lot of kind of UD organizations and small businesses as well. So when the city formed the Public Development Authorities, there's 3 of them in town, we're one of 3. It was really intended to be kind of a more grassroots form of economic development. So how all of these entities could kind of collaborate and come together in further developing our community. This is the boundaries for the UDA. It's called our UD revitalization area. So this is what the state looks to when they're collecting the property and sales tax that we receive. We receive a very small percentage of city sales and property tax that we can reinvest. And as you can see, it goes up just past Sharp Avenue. So we're in the UD right now. It goes down to close to I-90 in the south, and then Brown and Division are the boundaries on the west, and really the Hamilton overpass and the river is the boundary on the east. So the University District and the City of Spokane actually sit in an ecotone, and I learned this from biomimicry folks. And I'll kind of be peppering in biomimicry throughout the presentation, but basically, an ecotone is when two different bioregions overlap and they come together. So Spokane really sits between both the northern Rockies, which consists of conifer forests, and then the Palouse Prairie. And what's interesting about being in an ecotone is in nature, ecotones are often that overlap area where creativity happens in nature and innovation happens. So as an innovation district, I'm really excited to align with that. We're also at a traditional crossroads. So we sit, as we all do, on the indigenous lands of the Spokane. And this area in particular was a crossroads for not just the Spokane, but a lot of the tribes in the inland northwest, particularly during fishing season. The image on the upper right is from a survey that was completed in the late 1800s and shows kind of the curve in the river where the University District is today, where the WSU Life Sciences campus is. And you can start to see a lot of the trails that were documented from the indigenous tribes from that time period. So a little bit of history on the UD. When Expo 74 happened in the early 70s and they started pulling out the railroads from the center of the downtown, it vacated quite a bit of land throughout the city. And the UD, basically where the WSU Life Sciences sits today, was full of railroads, and that was pulled out. By the late 80s, a group of businesses and property owners came together to decide, okay, what should we do with this land? And out of that kind of grew this idea, how can we build upon what's already there with Gonzaga University and expand that? And so this idea of kind of a joint campus between Eastern Washington and WSU happened at that time, and then additional buildings were built, and then finally in 2009, the nonprofit was founded, and then in 2011, the PDA. Here's some images from 1967. You can see where all the rail lines went through, and then where the WSU campus is today. So the University District, the population is actually quite small when you think of permanent residents. So it's just over 3,500 people live in the UD. That doesn't include the 11,000 students that are within the University District, unless they're permanently, they own a home and they permanently live there. We are also at the center of the opioid crisis for Spokane, with Division and Brown running along our west side. We've experienced a tremendous amount of overdose deaths within the district. We've also, because of Highway 2 running along Division and Brown, there's a lot of concerns about pedestrian and bicycle safety. And we also have carry a lot of the burden of the housing crisis with houselessness. We also have a tremendous urban heat island effect. And the image on the upper right is from the Gonzaga's Institute's Beat the Heat study that they completed. And as you can see in the south sub area, there's a tremendous afternoon heat effect there. It's almost unbearable in the summer to walk through the south sub area. And that's reflected in the lack of tree canopy and the abundant impervious surfaces. We also have a really high poverty rate within the University District. We have 2 overlapping census tracts, and you can see they're both over 50%. I thought I'd also just touch finally on kind of climate impact and environmental justice. A lot of this comes from the research that Brian and his team has done, but Spokane, since 2015, Spokane has averaged 8 unhealthy smoke days per year, up from 0 between 1999 and 2011. In recent years, the number of days in Spokane over 90 degrees has increased. In 2019, it was just 13 days. This last year, it was 34 days. And as most of you know, there was an urban heat island effect here, or I'm sorry, there was a heat dome effect here in 2021 that killed 112 people in Washington, including 19 in Spokane. And the chart to the right shows kind of the two census tracts for the UD and just the impact that environmental issues and put on the health burden of those communities. So, lead paint, Superfund proximity, asthma, heart disease, all of those numbers are quite high for the UD. So I'm gonna have a sip. So as I mentioned, this is where I get into the really uplifting part of the presentation. Probably many of you realize we are facing converging crises right now, not just climate change. Recently, Johan Rockström, he is the director for the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research in Germany. He was on a number of TED Talks last summer. He did a fantastic TED Talk. If you haven't seen that, I would greatly encourage that. But he really started talking about kind of the issues around planetary boundaries and how we are exceeding those right now as a planet. And this image pretty clearly shows, many of you probably are aware that we've exceeded now 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries that allow us to live on this planet. Climate change is just one of those. And ocean acidification is getting close to exceeding its boundary as well. And so it's not just, climate change is a big problem, of course, as we know, but it's really part of a larger problem of overshoot, that we are living beyond our capacity for the Earth to carry how we're living. And this image here, this is also from Johan Rockström's presentation, and I found it really fascinating because he listed, I think, the 16 big biophysical systems that are part of our planet. And scientists are just in the last few decades trying to understand how interrelated all these systems are for the health and well-being of all of us. And many of them are in the process of either collapse or die off. And you can see the ones between the 1 and the 2 with the dot in the middle, that's at about 1.5 degrees, they really start to collapse. And then the other ones, are further out. But what they're starting to see and understand is that if one collapses, it starts to create tipping points for the others. So there's a lot of unknowns still around how these systems operate, but they are very much in relationship with one another. He also, this last year is the first year that we have global average temperatures did exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And we're not sure if that's gonna, most likely that will not drop. The image on the right is also from Johan Rockström, kind of showing the amount of carbon we've consumed largely in the last couple hundred years, to about 2,000, close to 2,600 gigatons. He estimates we have about 200 gigatons left, which, before we see pretty massive collapse of those biophysical systems. And that's at about 5 years. So this isn't just an issue of, we love nature and we want to be a part of nature, but this affects everything. We can't have a healthy economy if we don't have a biosphere. The estimates that this has to the cost of people by the year 2050 would be $38 trillion per year. The U.S. is facing, we'd be facing about an 18% loss in GDP globally. And there's a recent study that just came out, I think 2 days ago, really looking at the impact of climate change on insurance rates. Those have really skyrocketed in the last 10 years. I think the estimates are in the next 30 years we could see over 70,000 neighborhoods impacted by climate change directly at a net cost of about $1.5 trillion. So all of this actually equals money, and it affects how people are living. And then I think it's also important to really start to understand how much energy we're using. So in the last 30 years, or even 40 years, since 1990, There's only been 3 periods of time where we have actually used less, we've emitted less carbon. That was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the global financial crisis in 2008, and then the COVID pandemic a few years ago. But since then, we have been increasing every single year the amount of carbon we're emitting globally. And then this shows how new energy sources like solar, wind, so far they're just on top of the fossil fuel emissions of carbon. So they are not affecting our use of fossil fuels at this point. They've just been additive to that. And I am all for, you know, solar and wind and electric vehicles. I drive an electric vehicle, but I think we also need to realize that we can't put all of our hope in just those systems. We also need to be looking at with a much wider lens on how we're going to address this crisis. And then I think energy literacy is also really important for all of us as we move into the coming decade, and to understand our consumption of energy, what energy means, how it's distributed. Right now, for instance, in a barrel of oil, it's very difficult to just like quit gasoline, because in a barrel of oil, gasoline is one component that comes out of a barrel of oil. But everything from, you know, fuel oil to how we heat our homes, to diesel oil, to oil, the lighter oils that produce our plastics, all of that comes from one barrel of oil. So even if you start moving the market away from gasoline-powered cars, you still need to find a use for all those other aspects of the barrel of oil. And it's also interesting in that where oil comes from also affects what it's made up of. So for instance, the oil that usually comes from the US is it's great for gasoline, but we don't have great oil for diesel products. So that we need to get either from Canada or Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of complexity in oil and how we use it and how we access it. And it's not just simple, you know, let's stop oil. And this chart kind of starts to show that petrochemicals are just throughout our entire society in so many ways. And when you zero in on that, you can start to see all the things that a barrel of oil supports, everything from cosmetics to automotive uses, to antifreeze, to detergents, to electronics. It just kind of goes on and on and on. Oil supports the development and manufacturing of all of those things. So if you haven't checked out The Great Simplification, it's an absolutely fantastic podcast talking about a lot of these overlapping systemic issues. He does have some really hopeful ones that's interspersed, but he's really encouraging his listeners to really take a wider lens to how we address these issues. So it's not just we focus on the carbon issues, but we also look at the economic consequences. We look at the other planetary boundaries and their well-being. With electric vehicles, we don't just look at that, but we look at how many vehicles are we consuming every year. We produce about 100 million new cars per year, but we only have 80 million babies born per year globally. And then there's a lot of potential impacts from AI that we're just starting to understand, which I'll get into in a minute. And also just understanding energy. So our energy use. So when you look at carbon emissions related to energy use globally, the 2 biggest users are really energy use in industry, and then agriculture and forestry and land use. Those are those 2 big compartments. Globally, personal vehicle transportation is only about 8%. In the state of Washington, we're at about 33%. So, but planetary boundaries and the well-being of our planet is a global issue. So trying to understand where the levers are if we really want to make a change in what we're emitting. And then this is starting to get to the point of how generous nature is with us. So nature really acts as a buffer for all the carbon that we're emitting right now. As you can see, we emit about 88% through direct carbon emissions, and then 12% of carbon emissions come from land use changes. And the sinks for that are, first off, the oceans. The oceans allow us to sink about just over 10 gigatons of carbon per year. Our forests, about 12.3 gigatons, and then the rest of it goes into the atmosphere. And we have about a 4% budget imbalance right now in how much carbon we're emitting. So these are just from the last few weeks. Scientists are getting incredibly alarmed at how warm the ocean is becoming just in the last few years. They're not even quite sure why it's warming so quickly. But again, it's as these natural systems start to get very overburdened. Right now, the ocean holds about 90% of the Earth's heat, and as we're overburdening that ocean, it's just the temperatures are skyrocketing. And some of the ways to ameliorate this would be industrial fishing is a huge impact on, on basically it's, the mass amounts of fish that we're pulling from the ocean are actually pulling kind of the life force from the ocean. It's that exploitation of marine resources that really affects the ability of the ocean to sequester carbon. And then there's a whole complexity around the phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton, the ocean actually, all the ocean species, or all the species within the ocean are really supported by a small 1 millimeter organism that really is the basis for the entire food source for the ocean. And as we're dumping more plastic pollution and styrene and chemicals into the ocean, it creates this kind of gunk on the top that these phytoplankton are eating, and then they're dying. So we're destroying that food source. And so a lot of oceanographers that are following the climate health of the ocean really feel that one of the primary ways we could address climate very quickly is to pull plastics and chemicals out of the ocean as quickly as possible. And then land. Our land has been drying out. Our Earth is overheating. Again, this came out last week. 77% of the Earth's land has been drying over the last 3 decades. 40% of the planet is now dry lands or arid areas. And our energy consumption. A lot of what we need to do is simplifying, is learning how to reduce our impact in our energy use. And whereas there's wonderful things around AI, and AI could bring a lot of efficiencies with it, it also brings a tremendous amount of impact to energy use. So it's 10 times the computing power of a regular online research. A ChatGPT system can use as much energy as 120 US households over the course of a year. 5 terabytes of data in an hour are roughly the equivalent of an average American's household internet data use for an entire year. So all of a sudden we're adding on this additional user in a planet that's already very overburdened. And this is causing all sorts of issues. I have a quote here from Simon Michaud. He's a geologist in Finland, and he's talking about copper reserves. And we'll need about 4.5 billion tons of copper to manufacture in just one generation, just for renewable technologies. That doesn't include expanding our entire grid, which really is reliant on copper, and that would support AI expansion as well. He says we only have about 880 million tons probably left in the earth. So there's a lot of concerns around where we're gonna get these minerals. There's a lot of people now fighting for these minerals. There's violence that just erupted in the last few months in the Congo, a horrible war basically around these rare earth minerals. We're gonna be hearing more and more about that. And then this is within our own state of Washington. This happened last year. I think Washington has been incentivizing data centers that support AI. Grant County, was a great way of economic development for them. They had excess energy. They brought in these data centers. The data centers are now using so much energy that the county's heading towards either violating the state green energy law or risking rolling blackouts for homes, factories, and hospitals. So the grid right now is just really maxed out. It's not able to support all the data centers we're really wanting to put forward. I did hear that Governor Ferguson just created a workforce to look at data centers within the state of Washington and understand their impact at a deeper level. So, we're starting to figure these things out, but it's all very complex and interrelated. So with that, I'm going to get into the generosity of nature. this is a quote from Janine Benyus. She's the founder of the Biomimicry Institute, and she's a wonderful human being. Biomimicry actually worked with us on our next generation conceptual plan, but she really always stresses just the brilliance of nature and how it has evolved over these billions of years to really be so graceful and so thoughtful in its functions and how it moves energy around and water around, and it supports a biodiversity of life. And nature always wants life, and it's always moving towards life. And so what the nature positive movement is really starting to look at is how can our development of systems start to reflect that quality and that brilliance that nature brings to development. And we now are destabilizing our planetary water cycle, industrial agricultural and impermeable services, destructive forestry, and why it's important to look at our cities and how they're developed. 56% of the world's population lives in cities. Cities account for more than 70% of global emissions, and we have a tremendous amount of impervious surfaces. So I think 14% of the land in the US alone is impervious. And cities can help nature capture carbon. They can sequester, estimates are up to soils through across the globe, but cities being a part of that could sequester 1.5 gigatons. Trees and other types of vegetation, 7.9 gigatons. Wetlands sequester 2 times the amount of all forests. The estimates are that we could capture an additional 20 gigatons via regenerative agriculture, urbanism, and carbon farming. So what is nature positive design, urban design? So the image on the right is actually from the University District. We established these 3 goals with the board in the last few years, really looking to prioritize how we invest in the community. And then the quote on the right is from Dana Baumeister and Nicole Miller, both from Biomimicry Institute. And what it's really looking at is how all aspects of a city, its buildings, its infrastructure, and natural surroundings should actively contribute to environmental health. So how can our cities actually start to learn from the brilliance and wisdom of nature and start to reflect that in how it's developed? How can we actually start to learn to live in relationship with nature instead of destroying our life source? And Medellin is doing this in Colombia. They've created like 30 green networks throughout the city. The impacts have been tremendous. They've been reducing their urban heat island effect. They've been sequestering a ton of carbon. They actually have reduced the urban heat right now by about 2 degrees Celsius within the city. They've also just created better community through these green corridors. So it is happening, and this is just kind of one of the more significant examples. And in the UD, we're really kind of looking at how can our urban development respond to these ecological boundaries that we're faced with, but then also looking at a healthy economic system that responds to that. And how we started. So a couple years ago, I brought on a group called Green Economics from the west side of the state, and we conducted an ecological asset study. So we started looking at what are the systems that create clean air, that create clean water, that sequester carbon naturally within the UD, and how did they function in a pre-development setting? So they interviewed professors at Gonzaga, WSU, Eastern. We met with Spokane tribal members, really trying to understand that kind of pre-development ecosystem and how it worked. And we learned a ton. And we looked at these kind of 12 different core ecosystem services. And we started to create measurements around those. So we're creating targets for those that our urban development wants to try and meet, kind of based on the pre-development conditions. So how can what we build in the next 20 years start to function at such a high level that we are cleaning air and we're sequestering carbon, and we're also creating community as we do that? So this shows kind of a cross-section of that riparian corridor, largely pre-development, and how that worked. This shows kind of an overlay of integrating the public realm, pedestrian paths and wildlife viewing, streets and bike lanes, native street trees. And then again, how the built environment could start to lay into that through rainwater harvesting and grade use, living building construction, bioswales, enhanced landscapes. And then from there, we really wanted to bring on a firm to help us visualize, okay, what does this look like? Okay, we know generally we want to apply these principles, but how can we start to share our actual vision in a concrete way with people? And how can it also help us prioritize how we move forward with our initiatives? So we brought on Mithun from Seattle about a year ago and conducted kind of a large district planning process. And we utilized the Just Communities protocol. So we looked at both the impacts from climate and social equity and justice issues and how those will inform urban development. And we conducted lots of outreach. So this builds on outreach that the UD had already done, but we did have a large groundwork forum. We had open houses. We had focus groups with the House of Charity and folks living in the permanent supportive housing in the UD. We conducted interviews. And then, we started to get feedback on what's the community's priorities for the UD. We also invited students, so there was a number of GU students and Whitworth students that attended. So these are the 6 that kind of came out of that. A place for multicultural food and gathering, a fully connected district for pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users, a place of healing, really looking at issues of racial equity, houselessness, and opioid issues, and try and create a healing environment for those. The river as a family member, food sovereignty as part of a nature-based model vision, and then the potential to positively impact adjacent districts. So from there, we developed a palette that really reflected the nature-based strategies. I'll go into a little bit more about the coulee systems and the blue-green systems, but everything from clean water parks to district renewable energy production to shared energy systems. So this kind of started to help inform how we were going to develop. And then these were the equity, inclusion, and belonging strategies palettes. So everything from multicultural market to placekeeping, to inclusive wayfinding and storytelling, to a community resilience hub, to inclusive childcare. And then we really honed in on the nature-based infrastructure. We really wanted to see that as sort of the backbone of the urban development, like addressing that first. And there's a number of reasons why that's important beyond all the reasons I just showed you. We also have a lot of small business owners that when they come into the district and they have a change of use, they're expected to upgrade all of their stormwater runoff on site. And for really small businesses, this can be pretty detrimental. I have some friends that relocated a cidery, and their costs were in excess of like $150,000 to do that, and they weren't expecting that. So we're also hoping that by a really shared, comprehensive approach and thoughtfulness to stormwater management, that we can also make it a lot easier to support small businesses in the region. But these are some of kind of the tools we're also implementing around that. The blue-green infrastructure, the coulee, I'll talk a little bit more about those, clean soil parks and trails, and then clean water parks. So the blue-green infrastructure that we're proposing would happen largely north of the river, so just east of Gonzaga. The soils there are readily close to the surface, so we can easily kind of pull the water back into the soil. So we're looking at potentially like stormwater runoff, rainwater garden collections that could move into these coulees that could then irrigate landscapes, but also provide cooling for the district and support things like pollinators and other, wildlife, birds, and kind of the health of the whole system. South of the river, we're looking at more of a coulee system. There's a tremendous amount of basalt south of the river, and so we're looking at how these coulees could actually convey rainwater runoff and stormwater runoff into these conveyance systems and then deposit them into areas where they can then be reabsorbed back into the soil, and supporting plant life and trees along the way. So I showed earlier, the south sub-area is really the worst in regards to the urban heat island effect and the lack of street trees. And many of the street trees that have gone in recently, they're not doing well. And if a lot of this, if it's done thoughtfully, you can actually reduce your long-range maintenance costs. And so I have started working with Oregon State University has a really fantastic permaculture program. And so I've been working with them on how we could start to be really smart and kind of innovative in how in the plants that we choose and the soils that we build up, how this could actually be very low maintenance in the long run. So Methuen came back with kind of these 6 key nodes, and I'm just going to share some of the imagery from that. The first one is this cycle of life food hub. This would be just east of here, kind of north of No-Lie area, really looking at how, food innovations around research and development, a cycle of life food hub, all of that could be kind of interspersed with housing and the blue-green infrastructure that I mentioned. And then this starts to show some of the imagery around that. This shows an area where the Centennial Trail comes in. We're also right now working with Spokane River Forum in regards to like a kayak put in near here. But this would be kind of a fantastic kind of public gathering space around local food, our agricultural economy, and kind of, again, supporting our natural systems to kind of celebrate place. This is the Heel, the river, and reforest. So any ways through kayak put-ins, through overlooks, through stormwater parks, ways that we can increase activity along the river. Riparian corridor restoration is also important. And this starts to show some of that imagery. And then this multicultural maker district. So looking at, this is just kind of east of Division, south of Sprague in the University District, how things like makerspace and community gardens and community-oriented services can all kind of live together and create a real thriving area for a lot of people living there today and ideally expanded living. And this shows like a sectional cut through a street showing that coulee infrastructure and how the basalt rock would be exposed that's existing there, and then the water would be funneled, and then it would support pollinator gardens. There could be green jobs training. We are partnering right now. We have a grant from the Community Economic Revitalization Board to really study this in detail, creating a makerspace over there. And the community colleges are interested in being a part of that study. So this is kind of moving forward a little bit. And then Main Arts Avenue Culture Corridor along Sherman. And then really creating a heart for the district at the south landing of the bridge with a fitness and climbing gym center. This kind of shows some of that, how we'd start to reconnect the East End, West Main area with the WSU Spokane campus through arts and culture. And then an innovation commons. So one of the most destructive things that happened in the University District was Interstate 90 kind of coming through and really bisecting the district from both South Perry and from East Central neighborhoods. And so this is really looking as a way to kind of heal that wound, kind of reconnect. So looking to lid over Interstate 90 between Sherman and Arthur and create a large, big public park that could really reconnect not only to South Perry, but to the hospital districts as well. And also really supporting the life sciences innovation. We're also looking at this kind of area on the right of this image where Sprague Way is, kind of really restoring that back to a natural system, kind of a natural trails and a park that could then link back down to the main river, similar to almost like the Highline Park in New York, but along an old abandoned, well not abandoned, but no longer in heavy use highway remnant. And it starts to show some of that. So really looking at how ponderosa pine groves can be integrated into the urban environment. Ponderosa pines are a massive carbon sequester plant, and so we want to try and introduce those and bring them back into the UD as much as possible. The Miyawaki Forest is another component we'd love to integrate into this, but also still bring in office and laboratories and mixed-use residential. And then this shows the Sprague Way rebuild, of how it really becomes this kind of bike ped nature kind of sacred place almost, or park within the district. So going forward, one of the recommendations from our next generation plan was to really start looking at a district thermal energy analysis. So we met with Avista and the Scott Morris Energy Innovation Center and EDO that's really looking at energy innovations throughout the state of Washington. And this really came up as the #1 thing the UD could start doing. They are doing something like this right now in First Hill in Seattle. So Seattle U, along with the hospitals up there, they're starting to look at their actual energy use as institutions and then determine where is the waste energy and how can you re-divert that. And then how can you actually tap into more thermal energy uses within the district as well. So this is something we want to move forward in the next year. Another aspect is we're wanting to build this urban ecological development tool. So kind of looking at those targets that we created through the ecosystem services study that we did, and looking at today's energy use, like what is the per capita energy use within the district, what's the per capita water use within the district, and how can we start to track and measure that, and through development over the years actually start to see that decline, but actually see quality of life improve. And then also looking at development incentives and a code audit. So kind of the pragmatics, how do we incentivize this? You know, the things that we want to see happen, how do we make it easy for developers to do that? I am going to be working on a large kind of district financing strategy this year too, like prioritizing how to get the most out of what we're proposing, what we should be prioritizing, what kind of partnerships should we be building. We're really trying to think comprehensively about how we can start to move the needle. So with that, that's where we're at. Thank you. Well, you got that? Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really a great basis for, I'm hoping, a good conversation. Students in particular, I'm going to turn to you first, so start thinking, if you haven't already, of a question for Juliet. But I'll kick us off. If we go back to the basic idea of your presentation, nature-based, just if you could give a really concise definition of nature-based, and what's the opposite of nature-based? Or what's the term and the definition you'd give?
Yeah, I mean, for me, nature-based is looking to nature's systems. So how, for instance, in the water cycle, it supports, through how it takes water, through a tree and stores it in its soil that then allows for healthy soils, that then provides food for other, plants and animals, and then it evaporates and it provides cooling. I mean, there's like multiple uses that it does within that system. And how can an urban system start to reflect that and kind of be built on that as its core? So rather than do urban development and then throw in like some street trees and a few parks, it's more like, no, you kind of create that healthy nature-based infrastructure first, and then the urban development, kind of the built environment comes in after that.
And what's the opposite?
The opposite would be, purely just focusing on the built environment from probably with a narrow lens, not seeing that urban development also needs to be understanding the larger impact on our entire biosphere when it happens. So, if there's just a narrow lens applied to urban development, they're not going to be thinking.
Is there a name for that school of thought?
Speculative or. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Okay. I mean, I don't know if there's a name for that.
As a philosopher, I'm just interested in taxonomy here. Okay.
Yeah. Pure capitalism.
Yeah. All right, let's jump out. If anybody have a question for Juliet you'd like to ask? So I've got a whole bunch myself so that I can have all the fun. Starting with students first. Be brave. All right. If you'd mention maybe your name, if you would, and your major, if you're feeling like it.
I'm Ethan. I'm double majoring in business and accounting. My question is, how do you expect to pay for all this? Would it be through a series of grants or taxpayer dollars?
Well, we did go after an EPA community change grant, but that now is we turned ours in much later, and so I'm not holding my breath that money is going to be made available. But we were hoping to do like a pilot. The city had given me the go-ahead to look at Cowley Street as an initial pilot for some of these principles. So I am going to continue to look for funds like that to start to pilot some of this, because the city has been great. They've been really supportive of this vision and wanting to help it happen, but they also need to have kind of proof positive too. You know, it's interesting, I just had my board meeting prior to this, and Mayor Brown is on my board, and she had a lot of great ideas for me on how to start thinking about it from a financial development standpoint. And so, in a nutshell, lots of partnerships need to start happening. Yeah.
Since a business and accounting student asked, what's the short version of tax increment financing, and how does that relate to your work?
Yeah,
Sounds
complex.
Yeah.
That's part of our interlocal agreement between the city and county, but we get a very small percentage of the city's portion of sales and property tax within our district. And it's less than like their percentage is 1%, and we get half of that within our district.
And that wouldn't be enough to fund what you're talking about here.
So we sunset as a PDA in 2039, and we'll probably, the estimates are, if everything stays as is, we'd get about 15 million from now until then. And really, to do something like this, we probably need 500 million, you know, to really catalyze it. So,
So if anybody's got an extra 500 million,
yeah.
talk to Juliet.
If you want to
afterwards.
donate.
Got another one back here. Just mention your name and major if you would.
Hi, I'm Annie Cooper. I'm an environmental studies major. And I was curious with the current administration if that will make it more difficult to move forward with plans like this.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think just the fact that I think the remaining funds for the CUNY Change Grant will not go out is a huge impact across the country. I know they had a tremendous response to that grant, and so the need is really great for things like this. You know, I have a grant team that I work with, and we're kind of riding off the federal government for the next 4 years. So we're looking really at a lot of state grants. The state has a really great Complete Streets program through the Transportation Improvement Board that we'll probably be pursuing some of those. I'm going to be trying to be doing some educating of the TIB board around nature-based infrastructure and the importance of it in urban development. So I'm hoping that maybe their lens and how they define complete streets will expand a little bit as well. But yeah, definitely focusing on the state level and maybe some private philanthropy type stuff too. Yeah.
All right, open it up to anybody who's interested.
Hey, Juliet, it's Brian. I had a question about the city's comprehensive plan that's currently being planned and how this project fits into that. I know you did mention some regionality influence that you were hoping for, but can you maybe explain, like in your world, what that would look like, ideally?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So I'm like a sister organization to the city. I'm independent of the city, but I can't really do anything independently of the city, particularly when they own all the infrastructure. So I have to, you know, keep them in the loop. And I have started conversations with Spencer Gardner on the pros and cons of having the city formally adopt a plan like this.
And Spencer Gardner is?
He's the planning director for the city of Spokane. And so I definitely want my board to adopt this, and that'll give it a little bit more teeth. But yeah, I think the next process, if I could get the city to adopt it, then it potentially has the impact to be integrated more. So,
Would you say that modification to the Growth Management Act, which was passed a couple of years ago by the legislature, which is requiring the comprehensive plan to include climate element for the first time, and so now the comprehensive plans for counties around the state are going to require them to include how they're going to mitigate emissions and improve resilience. I assume that would create an opportunity for you to partner with the city. Is that right?
I would think so, yeah. The city staff got this presentation last summer when it was still pretty nascent. I need to go back to them and kind of, there's a few people I kind of keep in the loop, but I need to probably connect with the larger planning group right now. But yeah, it seems like there could be a lot of overlap. And I think so much of the state, I think from a planning perspective, has been so much around electrification, which is important, but I think it's just part of the puzzle piece, and we need to be thinking again. So I think part of it's educating people about that wider lens. So.
All right. Other questions might we have from the crowd?
Hi.
Oh, I'm Catherine Alexander from Soil Smart, Soil Wise. I know a lot, to segue off what Brian was talking about, a lot of the comprehensive plan changes for climate have really been focused on greenhouse gases, not so much water. And a lot of what you've talked about really has to do with water. How does that mesh?
Yeah, definitely water should be part of that. And I think a lot of it is just starting to educate people with that broader lens. In a way, I don't think what I'm really looking at is that different, but I have been surprised. I did present to TOD last year some of these initial concepts, and they thought it was just groundbreaking. I think a lot of state employees, they haven't really been looking at that broader lens. And so, again, I think it's just getting the word out and kind of educating. And if I could start to do some pilots that start to show, the water impacts. That's one thing I'm getting a lot from the city is, oh, how much maintenance is this going to take? That's a big concern that they have. And I keep telling them, I think it'll actually use less water. It'll be much easier to maintain than what you're doing right now. And so I need to be able to at least find the finding for a pilot.
It's a good transition to, as a philosopher, I can't help but steer us in that direction. How much of the problem that you're trying to solve would you say is primarily, or maybe exclusively, a technical problem, a design problem? Is it entirely a design problem? So if you could just get the right design, there wouldn't be any problems left? Or do you think that part of the problem is conceptual? Do hearts and minds matter to this equation, or is it really just design?
Can I say both? Yeah, I think it's important for, I'm a designer, so I love design. I love design problems. And so for me, starting to become aware of the notion of planetary boundaries and ecological limits, it was like, okay, how can we design a city that's really beautiful and thriving and, full of life and that's also uses way less energy, that's just much smarter, that's just more thoughtful. And so I think that there is that component of the design problem, and I do feel that if, things like that could start to be shown in pilots or other types of development that, and measured, like you have to kind of make the case through measurement too, that, hey, look at this fantastic district and it's only using this, or it's using, 25% less energy than it did 10 years ago when it was nothing. I think when you can start to kind of make that case, hearts and minds easily come along, because I am wanting to do both and, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, yeah. Perfect segue. Ann Hannenberg, practicing landscape architect here in Spokane. Love where this is going and want to be able to implement these types of treatments, in our built environment. Suggestions, how do we move the needle? We have these opportunities, and yet our hands are so frequently tied. We meet with the city, we serve on boards, we help write code, and yet when it comes to getting things permitted so that it can be built with these types of treatments, we're told, no, we can't do that. So I don't know, what is the solution? How do we move the needle? And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's not a fair question, but.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic that people like you, and I know Brian, you're with the sustainability task force now with the city, and I know you're super involved with city stuff, that the more that people bring their know-how, to city policy and processes, the better. Again, for me, city staff, I have a mayor right now that's very supportive, so that's awesome for me. And so city staff, and I have built a nice relationship with city staff, so they are supporting me. I think they probably think this is a little bit crazy, and they do have concerns, but again, if I could get a pilot in and start to actually measure it and start to give them feedback that, that's one of the things in biomimicry is you gotta have constant feedback. And if that feedback can be shared, then you start to change minds and hearts, so, yeah.
I'm curious if there are students in the room who are intrigued and they're like, oh, this sounds like really interesting. We don't have an urban planning program here or architecture. What would you say to a young person who's like, this sounds really cool. How would what do I do? Do you employ students? Can they intern with you? What is a path forward for people who are interested in this if they wanted to explore it more?
Yeah, we're a really small staff right now. We are hoping to kind of build up a little bit in the next few years. To be quite honest, it's hard for me to have a lot of time to really put forward the support. I think an intern needs to have a good intern experience. But we do partner with universities. So when I first came on, we were partnering with the civil engineering group here, looking at the bike ped corridors in the UD. I'm now going to start a program with University of Idaho architecture students to look at the division corridor in partnership with a few other folks. But so that's kind of the easiest way for me to partner with students right now. Also the Spokane River Forum, Happy's here. We're talking about partnering with some riparian corridor stuff that would bring in some Gonzaga students too. But I think as a young person, it would kind of depend. I mean, there's so many different avenues you could come in at around these topics. I mean, biomimicry, I think, is just hands down fantastic. Arizona State University has a biomimicry program that you can get your master's in, and they do online as well. And they have fantastic global field trips that they do. They also have just workshops. Like Amanda and I both each at one point did the biomimicry certification for leadership and social innovation. And so those are just week-long programs. You can kind of get your feet wet and see if it's something that you like. I think it's interesting, you don't, other than biomimicry, I also think permaculture is, I am just blown away with permaculture. Some of the work that Andrew Millison and his team are doing at Oregon State University around permaculture is just, it's like magic, how they build systems that retain water. They're doing a lot of work globally, particularly in Africa. Another woman, Natalie Topa, she does a lot, she's a permaculturist too, and she does a lot on the global level in Africa and Yemen on these incredibly dry urban environments, how you can start to retain water and hold those for communities, for growing food, for cooling. I think that permaculture is a really fantastic program as well that could inform this kind of work.
At Oregon State, you said?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If somebody emailed you, would you be willing to respond to them?
Sure, yep.
You already got one. You can't have two.
Ryan Anderson, just an interested local citizen. My question is, first off, what a great vision that you've proposed here and showcased. And a lot of these things I would describe as beautification in every aspect of this district. So my question is, in prioritization of looking at these things, there are limited finances, limited time, you just mentioned. In that prioritization, how is your organization thinking about making sure this happens across the district? Because I look at the map, the perimeter of this district has a distinctly different feel than the core of the district where the universities are located. So how do these beautification efforts happen across instead of just happening to continue to touch kind of the universities?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I work closely with the universities, but I don't have anything to do with university property. I don't tell Gonzaga what to do at all, or WSU. And they have their own kind of master planning team and their folks that plan for housing and all that. it's interesting. I'm going to steal from Mayor Brown, who just suggested this to me. She was thinking with each of those kind of those 6 different key places around the district to really bring in a set of kind of key people, like a business community person, a person from the universities, particularly if they have a program that, like UW has a really great forestry program that could potentially support it, and then you know, and just key people in the community that could really help move it forward, like almost like a little mini task force for each one of the 6 that could really start to help me move it forward. So that's something that's piqued my interest. You know, I've been trying to kind of strategize from a financial standpoint because we can bond as a PDA, you know, and I don't want to like waste my bond dollars and blow them in one, you know, development. I'd rather try and be strategic about that. So I've been kind of trying to think comprehensively at that level, but then also we've also looked at things like a UD investment fund. You know, how could we actually allow for community investment and things like this too?
One of the things I love about your presentation is it reminds me that we can't create what we can't imagine, and this helps you to imagine what's possible, which I do think is inspiring. You know, the changes of hearts and minds that'll then. So I think it could work both ways. Like you could create this vision and get people excited, and that of course then creates some pilots, and then it just creates a virtuous cycle. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, and please look up what the University District is doing and figure out ways to support them. Thank you all so much for coming. Let's thank Juliet Sinisterra one more time. We have our next talk next Wednesday about the annual International Conference of the Parties with Dr. Bi Zhao here in this room. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for coming. Absolutely, it's our pleasure.